Good afternoon, everyone, and warm welcome to this Colon International webinar on handling end-user complaints. We have about 200 registrations, and it's going to be interesting, so stay with us. My name is Arman. I'm the head of Postal at Colon International, which is a leading regulatory intelligence provider in a number of sectors, including telecoms, digital economy, media, and of course, Postal. Today with us on this webinar are two of our Postal analysts, Celine and Michael. Please welcome them. They will help us to discover this topic deeper, in particular, specifically, how European postal end users can make their complaints and to which bodies, what the typical nature of their complaints are, and finally, the postal service providers' obligations to compensate end users for late, lost, and damaged postal items, and if there are such obligations, what the levels of compensation are. The webinar will last for 1 hour. At the end, we will do our best to answer all of your questions, as many of your questions as possible. You have the possibility to write your questions in the designated field on your control panels. At the end, we will address the questions, as many as possible, as I've mentioned, but no question will be left unanswered. And after the webinar, we will reply to unanswered questions via email. Last but not least, we will solicit your feedback on the webinar via a short online survey after the webinar. And I strongly encourage you to share your opinions on the webinar with us for two reasons. One, this will help us to improve our future webinars. And two, you will help us to do some great charity work by planting a tree for each and every reply we receive from you. So just to begin with, let me ask the first question. Why is this topic important to us, and why are we talking about this today? Salim?
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Well, I'm sure that everyone has a story around a letter or a parcel being late, lost, or even damaged. And surprisingly, our colleague Bianca from our sustainability department texted me two nights ago saying that she got notified that her parcel was delivered, but when she went back home after work, the parcel was nowhere to be found. So she asked me, in that case, what can I do, and if I ever complain about such issue.
And what I keep getting in my apartment is I keep getting letters that are for someone who lives 2 streets away. So I find myself every 2 weeks playing postman, delivering someone else's letters. So I think everyone has stories like this.
Yeah, exactly. And the point is that parcel service are really important to people, whether they want to ensure that the e-commerce parcel arrive on time, they receive their official document from their bank or even the hospital, and for example, making sure that your Christmas card or present is sent to your grandma before the 25th of December. So people care about the service that they are promised, and if something goes wrong, then they want to feel empowered to do something about it, actually. Yeah.
But I think it's more than just a feeling that postal users like us, like many of our listeners today have. It's not just a feeling, it's also something that's reflected in the EU laws that regulate the postal sector, correct?
Yes, absolutely. So in Europe, we have the Postal Service Directive, which is the main regulatory framework for postal services, especially Article 19. And this article provides which complaints, what type of complaints, and which procedure we can use to resolve them. And interestingly enough, this provision falls under the Chapter 6 of the directive related to quality of service.
Right, and what I think is interesting about that is that we tend to think of quality of service as something which is about sort of targets and making sure that the mail arrives within a certain number of days, but actually the inclusion of end user complaints procedures like this within this chapter shows that quality of service is something a little bit more broad. And actually part of quality of service is also the ability for users to communicate with their postal provider.
Thank you both. It sounds really interesting, and apparently postal services are really very important for consumers. And as far as I understood, under the EU regulatory framework, this handling end user complaints mechanisms are also seen as a good way to improve the quality of postal services. So, Celine, can you please provide us with a bit more detail on that, especially about the requirements of Article 19 of the Postal Services Directive you have just mentioned?
So yes, so Article 19 gives actually the right to end user to complain about any issue in the postal sector. And about what? So the PSD, so the Postal Service Directive, emphasizes that such complaint may concern loss, theft, or damaged postal item, or even non-compliance with service quality standards. In most cases, it's mean late delivery. So in that case, the PSD says that the end user should complain first to the postal operator involved. And those operators need to provide them a transparent, simple, and inexpensive procedure to handle those complaints. But also the directive emphasizes and encourage, if I could say, the development of independent out-of-court dispute resolution schemes. And the purpose of those procedures is actually to provide them a fair settlement, which may include reimbursement and compensation. And lastly, if the end user are still unsatisfied with the outcome of the postal operator's procedure, or even worse, they don't even get a reply from them, they can still bring their complaint to what we call a competent national authority.
Right, and so to pick up on that point, it is specifically the postal operator that handled your item where you should go first, right?
Yes, and it makes sense since it's the operator that handles the letter or the parcel. The operator itself is more likely able to find the source of the problem and figure out what happened and hopefully find a solution. So yes.
So under Article 19 of the Postal Service Directive, member states, as we showed earlier on the slide, member states have to ensure that postal operators have their procedures which comply with three things. They have to be simple, they have to be transparent, and they have to be affordable. But that's at the EU regulation level. Could you perhaps go into a little bit more detail on how individual member states have then interpreted that in their national regulation?
Well, it's really different from one country to another. These three descriptors are really general, but a lot of member states actually stick to the same exact wording as the directive. Only few have regulated the issue in more details. For example, in Poland, you have a law specifically dedicated to complaint in the postal sector, and this law actually regulates the requirements that this procedure should have, and also which method the user needs to use to complain to the operator. And on the other hand, in Ireland and UK, for example, the postal regulator issue guidelines for those operators to help them to comply with Article 19. And for an example, for the purpose of an example, in UK, the parcel operators, needs to make sure that those procedures are really accessible, especially with user with high specific needs. And one other interesting point is that the outcome, so the solution, needs to be communicated in a clear and in a quick manner, and only by a trained staff, actually. Yeah.
Okay. So in this case, the guidelines really provide really good instructions on how to comply with the Article 19. I wanted to pick up something about the affordability criterion. There's quite a range in the way that member states apply this as well, at least in their regulation. Many countries, well, at least 4 countries, in particular France, Norway, Portugal, and Spain, the regulation actually says that it mustn't just be affordable, it must be free of charge. And while in other countries, the regulation doesn't go that far, they might keep the same wording. We did find that in practice, we find that most postal operators end up offering these kind of procedures free of charge in any case. Speaking more generally, there's many countries where the regulatory scheme which they have applied might not use the specific wording which we described earlier, these 3 criteria. They may have chosen to apply the Postal Directive and achieve the objectives of the Postal Directive by using different wording. So for example, this is the case in Austria, the Czech Republic, Germany, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. This uses different words to achieve the same aim. There's other countries such as Spain and Poland, which include only 1 or 2 of the criteria used in the directive. And then the Spanish law is interesting because it actually introduces something that's not in the directive, which is that there's the requirement that procedures should be non-discriminatory and should also embody the principles of proportionality and speed. So it goes a little bit in a different direction to try to achieve the same aim, which is a fair procedure.
So it's really diversified, and we also noticed that the directive does not necessarily require for operators to advertise about their complaints, but a few member states actually make it mandatory for those operators to proactively inform the consumer about their complaints. Is the case in Spain, where actually the post offices, or even what they call the customer service points, needs to make this information visible and with a lot of details to the consumer about their rights. So they need to be advertised. And this is the case also in Ireland, where actually the operator needs to draw up and publish a code of practice setting out their policy about how they handle complaints. And it's the same in Belgium, where operators are actually obliged to inform their user on their own website or on any commercial contract about the procedure, as well as the possibility to reach the independent mediation service dedicated to postal service in Belgium, called the Ombudsman, but we can talk about this later.
We'll definitely cover that.
Yes, and interestingly enough as well is that they also need to inform their own staff about the existence of this procedure. And lastly, the operators need to communicate information on the contact of this institute, the Ombudsman, at the end user's request.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so we've covered a little bit how postal operators end up having to apply the Article 19 framework under different, quite diverse national rules. But they also have a separate obligation about reporting the number of complaints they get, right, and the nature of them. Could you expand on this a little bit?
Yes, so actually under the Postal Service Directive, only operators providing services within the Universal Service Obligation are required to publicly publish the numbers of complaints that they received and how they were handled. However, we saw in many countries that actually all postal operators, so whether they are universal service providers or not, are actually obliged to report data on complaints to the National Postal Regularity Authority. This is the case in Denmark, Finland, Italy, Luxembourg, and in the United Kingdom. And for Sweden, it's a bit different, is that the NRA's request, so it's not automatic. And we also saw in the cross-border regulation, parcel regulation, all parcel operators need to actually notify the National Postal Authority about their procedure, including any limitation regarding their liabilities. So it's not only the Postal Service Directive that includes an obligation to inform, to report or to inform
about these end user procedures.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thanks again, both. So the first place postal end users will go with their complaints is their postal service providers, right? But if they remain unsatisfied or unhappy with the outcome of the postal service provider's procedure to handle their complaints, what are the available options for end users to escalate their claims? Michael, please, can you elaborate on this further?
Absolutely. End users are under the scheme, they can escalate their complaints to what are called competent national authorities, according to Article 19.2 of the PSD. As you just mentioned, and as Celine mentioned before, the end users must first exhaust their options with the operator, but it doesn't just mean that they are unhappy with the result. It might also be if the operator does not get back in time, if they do not get back at all, or if for some other reason the procedure fails at some point. One interesting exception to this rule is in Portugal. Well, it's definitely recommended to end users that they first contact the operator, and it's more likely that they will get a solution at the first stage of reaching the post operator, but they are not technically required to exhaust that procedure first. They can also go straight to the Arbitration Center for Consumer Disputes to get a solution there. Yeah. So
could you please specify what those competent national authorities are?
Definitely. There's quite a wide range, but we have kind of managed to categorize them in a range of different categories. So in different countries, it can be the competent national authority could be defined as the postal regulator. It can also be the ministry or a ministry that is put in charge of this responsibility. In some countries, it can be a consumer protection authority or some sort of consumer protection body. And finally, we also see in many countries this type of out-of-court alternative dispute resolution body. So you can see it's very different across member states. A lot of diversity in terms of how they've applied this scheme. In particular, across the 17 countries that we researched, what we found is that in 7 countries, users will be able to escalate their complaints to the postal regulator. In 6 countries, end users can escalate their complaint to one of these alternative dispute resolution bodies. And finally, in 3 countries, end users can contact their consumer protection authority. Spain is sort of a case apart again, because it actually has 2 organizations which can handle end user complaints. The way it works in Spain is that the postal regulator, CNMC, does not have competence in dealing with user complaints. They have other things to worry about. Instead, it's the Ministry of Transport which handles users' complaints, but only if those are related to the universal service. In other cases, they can also reach out, end users can also choose to reach out to the regional consumer arbitration boards, which handles all types of postal cases. So in summary, consumers have the choice. They may file a complaint before the Ministry of Transport if it's related to the universal service, and as long as they have not filed the same complaint to the consumer arbitration board.
So Michael, you just mentioned about alternative disputes bodies. So let me explain what it's referring to. So alternative dispute resolution bodies are an out-of-court dispute resolution mechanisms to help to solve any end-user complaints. So among the 17 EU countries that we analyze in our service, we can see again that there is a lot of diversity on how those bodies handle those complaints. And for example, if you see on the table on your slide, actually in France, the body, le médiateur de la consommation, is actually falling under the structure or responsibility of the universal service provider, La Poste in France. But also in Italy and Netherlands, it's a specific case where actually the universal service provider has its voice represented, usually together with the consumer rights group on this committee. And just to mention sort of a nuance with what we said earlier about Germany, Luxembourg, and Poland, we saw that those complaints were handled by the Postal National Authority, but actually those regulators do follow an alternative dispute resolution model. What I can say is that actually they try to really focus on finding and compromise rather than impose a decision, or they also might actually issue a non-binding opinion.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then how about the consumer protection authorities, which I mentioned earlier? Could you explain, are there some countries where those have been assigned as the relevant authority?
Yes, so it's mostly Nordic countries such as Finland, Norway, and Sweden. So in those countries, the Consumer Protection Authority or body, depending, is entitled to solve the end user complaints after they exhaust the operator's procedure. And in Finland, it's an interesting case because if the end user is not satisfied with the postal operator procedure, he needs to actually bring its complaint to what it's called the Consumer Advisory Service. And this body is actually run by the Finnish Competition and Consumer Authority. And what does this body is actually, it can give an advice, or it has also its own mediation service. And only then, if the consumer is still not happy with the outcome, it can only then bring to what we call the National Board for Consumer Disputes in Finland. So it's again different. The escalation is really different. Yes.
Yes, it's so interesting to see how different it is in different countries. One other point I would like to raise about all these different types of bodies and authorities that we've been talking about is that there is also quite a difference between countries in whether the particular authority has a general consumer protection expertise, or whether it really specifically handles postal complaints. Usually what you see when it's a consumer protection body at large, these are a little bit bigger. They usually have more staff and they have a wider range of expertise. But on the contrary, in some countries, such as Belgium, France, Italy, and the UK, the particular national authority has a very narrow postal focus and will really only take on postal cases.
Thank you, Michael. So do we know how long on average it takes to handle an end user complaint?
So this is an interesting question. It very much depends on whether we're talking about the time taken by operators or the time taken by these national authorities. So so under Article 19.2, as we mentioned earlier, all universal service providers must publish information on the number of complaints they receive. And as we saw in many countries, that duty is extended to lots of other post operators as well. However, as part of this publishing duty, not all USPs publish or report the exact amount of time they take to resolve them. However, we saw some reports that were published by individual universal service providers in particular, which did give us a clue. So for example, in Italy, the USP takes about 22 days to respond to complaints, although this will be a little bit longer, about 40 days if it's a complaint about postal offices, which kind of demonstrates again that quality of service is a broad term. It can include waiting time at the postal office, for example. And we see a very similar amount of time in Portugal, where the USP takes about 19 days on average for complaints about national services, and about 48 days for international services. In many countries, it's either regulation or universal service providers' own rules, own terms and conditions, shall we say, will define a certain time window during which operators have to respond to a complaint. And if the operator takes too long to respond to the end user, the complaint is often automatically upheld. So as just an example, in the Czech Republic, Czech Post's terms and conditions stipulate that it must respond to a complaint within 30 days. And if the end user receives a response with which they disagree, Czech Post may have a reasonable amount of time to review it again and then issue a sort of second opinion. And then the user has once again 30 days to apply for another procedure after that. And it's a similar story in Poland, where by law, the complaints about domestic services should be addressed within 30 days, and international complaints should be settled within 3 months. This disparity between national, or shall we say domestic services and international services is logical when you think about it, just because international disputes will often require the operator to check with a foreign operator to see if something went wrong on the other side. There's much more communication and much more delay. So it's logical that the regulatory framework in these countries takes this into consideration. And what we also see that in practice, we see that post operators will report longer resolution times for international complaints.
Okay, that was for the postal service providers, but what about competent national authorities? Celine?
Well, it's a different story for complaints that have been dealt or handled by these authorities. As you can see, there is a significant discrepancy in time to respond to those complaints. Even though we put all this body in this graph, we have to know that we can't really compare them in a way, because the procedures are completely different. The number of complaints that they receive it's not the same. So this graph is just to give you a picture, a snapshot of the different system that it exists inside the EU. For example, the Finnish body may handle 7,000 cases a year, where you can see that the UK body that is only dedicated to postal service complaints can handle 450 cases. But again, we can't really compare. It's not fair, but it's just to give you a whole picture. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for outlining the available procedures for complaints handling under the EU regulatory framework. So now let us talk about the types of complaints that can be brought forward in front of relevant authorities. You mentioned earlier that a postal end user may raise a complaint if their mail arrives late, if it is stolen, if it is damaged, or even lost. So can you just provide us with a bit more detail whether there are any standard definitions for these terms in the EU, like lateness, loss, damage? Please.
Yes, absolutely. So it might seem a bit silly to ask for a definition of these items. It's pretty clear when something is damaged, but I think it is an interesting question of procedure when you consider something late or lost. Is it a question of days? Is it based on the context? So I think it is a good question to ask whether there is a sort of standard definition for this. And what we see in at least in the Postal Service Directive, is that there is no definition of these terms per se. As we mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, the Postal Service Directive does have quality of service standards, which focus a lot on transit times, and especially targeted transit times, as well as the regularity and the reliability of the universal service. However, while it might be tempting to see that as sort of synonymous with lateness, it doesn't really translate clearly into a definition of late or lost. For example, just to take an example at a national level, when we see in Ireland, what is counted as a late item is 7 days, is a delay of 7 days, and only a delay of 7 days might give rise to the possibility for a claim, whereas the quality of service target in Ireland is to deliver 99.5% of priority mail within 3 weekdays. So while it might be tempting to see them as the same, they clearly are different, and I think it's logical that they should be different. One is a quality of service target, and the other one gives rise to an action. So while they are related, they're not the same thing. And what we could say is that, in a way, you could see end user complaints as sort of creating an additional incentive for operators to perform well, to perform a good quality of service. All right, so the PSD does not provide a definition of these concepts, but perhaps at a national level they might, right?
Well, according to our research, these definitions are not specifically regulated at the national level either. There is one exception, is in Belgium. So there is a royal decree that defines what's a lost item, sorry, under the universal service, and it's described as the physical disappearance while under the responsibility of the universal service provider. And for domestic item, this decree also adds that it will be considered as lost after 30 working days. But in most countries, these terms, this definition will be actually defined by the universal service providers in the terms and conditions. This is the case actually of 8 member states of the 70 analyzed member states. This is the case of Austria, Czech Republic, France, Germany, Netherlands, Poland, and finally the United Kingdom. But again, we see a variation in definition in those terms and conditions of those universal service providers. But according to our research, on average, we will consider a lost or a late item as early as 3 working days and up to 30 working days. So again, there is a lot of diversification in those definitions.
Yeah, that's like 3 and 40. That's a very wide
range. Yeah. Yes.
So of the 8 countries that we see on the slide, how many of them make sort of a distinction between lateness and loss, and how many of them have separate definitions for both of these?
Only 3. So it's France, Poland, and UK. To give you a quick examples, for example, in Poland, for registered item, it will be considered late after 14 working days and lost after 13 working days, so almost the double. And in United Kingdom, for domestic item, we'll consider a late item after 3 working days after the due date. Mm-hmm. And it will be only considered lost after 10 working days after the due date. So it's always this date that will be considered to calculate the timing. Yes. Okay.
Oh, thank you. So as we can see, the definitions for lateness, damage, loss are not typically found or provided in regulation at the EU and national levels. For the national level, the reasons, there might be a number of reasons for that, simply because first, the national regulatory authorities do not feel in a position to do so, simply because the Postal Services Directive doesn't provide any definitions. And also, secondly, general consumer protection and contract legislation already provides some sufficient protections, right? So now let us move into the next topic for today's discussion. Are postal operators obliged to compensate end users for late, damaged, and lost postal items? And if so, what are the levels of such compensation?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, strictly under the European framework, under Article 19.1 of the PSD, there is indeed the stipulation along these lines in which they say literally that postal operators' complaints procedure should provide, where warranted, for a system of reimbursement and/or compensation. However, note this phrase, where warranted. This is not really specified what that means exactly and when it might be warranted. This is I think it's very much left up to member states to decide if intervention through regulation is needed on this point. When we did some research to find out if a level of compensation is set by regulation, we found that this is the case in at least 4 countries, Belgium, Finland, and France. Yes, oh, sorry, Belgium, Finland, France, and the Netherlands, excuse me. And then in addition, in Luxembourg, we found that the level of compensation is actually mutually agreed by the USP and the postal regulator. In the remaining countries, what we found, or what we tend to see, is that the operators themselves set the maximum level of compensation, usually again in their terms and conditions. According to the latest annual report on complaint handling by the European Regulators Group for Postal Services, which was released a few months ago, not so long ago in any case, about 2/3 of European countries obliged the universal service provider to have a compensation scheme for customers, and especially in cases of damage, loss, and substantial delay. The problem we often run into when we try to compare different countries and the levels of compensation that are set in different countries is that they vary usually. So first of all, they might give different levels of compensation depending on whether it's about delay, whether it's about damage, or whether it's about loss, or they might not. They might set a similar fee. Furthermore, in some countries, they might base the maximum compensation by the value of the postage price. Alternatively, they might base it on the value of an item. They might base it on the weight of an item, or the compensation may be noted in a standard sum. For example, just to compare, in France, for a domestic letter, the maximum compensation that you might hope to get is just the postage of that letter. If you compare that to Finland, they cap the damages that you might get if there are any damages resulting from a late letter. It's capped at 50 euros, which is quite a difference. And then finally, the Polish law actually regulates that it should be 2 times postage maximum. I will just make a side note here that this story is very different when it comes to registered and insured items. These kinds of services bear far higher levels of compensation in case of delay, damage, or loss. But this is logical because in this case, the compensation is actually, in a way, one of the most important features of the service. It's arguably the main reason why people purchase registered and insured postal services, is so that they can be guaranteed a compensation, a significant compensation if something goes wrong. And I think it is for this reason also that most countries that we see include these services in the universal service. It's obvious that they see a need for this, and they don't think that irregular items should necessarily give rise to extremely high levels of compensation, and that instead, if a customer really wants this, they should be able to purchase a special service. One more note I wanted to make is that it is not necessarily only the Postal Service Directive which applies to compensation, especially when we're talking about international letters and parcels. There's also another source of legislation which governs this area, which is the Universal Postal Union Convention, in particular Article 2. And this is another this one sort of sets standard recompensation terms so that different signatories, particularly the Universal Postal Service provider in each of the signatory countries, have a standard set of reimbursement across the board.
Thanks much, Michael. And is this situation any different when it comes to e-commerce and online shopping, which is booming nowadays?
Yes, so there is another case, and I think it's very important to note this as well, that under Article 20 of another EU law, the EU Consumer Rights Directive, traders, what we call sellers essentially, must bear the risk and cost of damage and loss of a good until the consumer receives it. So what this means is that this law creates a situation where the consumer should be protected while their good is being transported, including by post. So this includes cases where the seller gives the consumer a range of choices of particular postal operators, for example, as long as, yes, and the only exception is where the risk lies on the consumer is if the consumer themselves insist or organize themselves a manner of transport, as long as this was not, as I just said earlier, one of the choices offered by the seller. I think this kind of liability arrangement makes sense because in most cases, in the case of e-commerce, it's the seller who decides on the postal carrier. It's the seller who has negotiated the terms with the postal carriers. They negotiate the price, the service standards, and the consumer has no contract, often no contact until it is actually delivered. In this scenario, and so it is logical that the liability should not fall on the consumer who had no choice in the way that it was brought to them. And then a final note is that the EU Consumer Rights Directive only applies to sales of goods between does not apply to sales of goods between two private individuals. It only consumer law in general only applies to business to consumer arrangements.
Many thanks, Michael. Just to sum up what we have just discussed. So Article 19 of the Postal Services Directive provides a relevant framework for handling end-user complaints in the postal sector, but the implementation across member states remains pretty diverse. End users, when they are unhappy about the quality of the postal service they get, they first address their complaints to their postal service providers, but still, if they remain unsatisfied with the outcome of their resolution procedure, they have several options to escalate their claims to competent national authorities, including postal national regulatory authorities, consumer protection bodies, postal ombudsman, and other alternative resolution bodies. End users may eventually be entitled for compensation for late, damaged, and lost postal items. And the amount of this compensation varies significantly, and it's hard to compare it. And normally, in most of the countries, we observe these amounts of compensation are not regulated, but rather stipulated in the postal service providers' terms and conditions. And the definitions, as you have told us, for lateness, damage, and loss is not found in the Postal Services Directive at the European Union level, but also can rarely found in national level, in national laws and regulations. Last but not least, when it comes to e-commerce and online shopping, the situation is slightly different because the contractual relationship is between the seller and the buyer, and eventually the seller bears the liability for the good until it reaches to the buyer. So yeah, this is kind of a wrap up of today's session. Thank you very much, Celine, Michael, and to the audience for your time and attention. And now we are basically ready to move to the Q&A session. I will see if there are any questions posted by the participants. We have a number of questions. So one is, are the resolution times presented the observed averages? Who may want to take this question?
Sorry, would you be able to repeat, please?
Sure. Are the resolution times presented the observed averages?
That's right. It's in each country. It's the observed. The countries where we reported this, it was the observed average. That's right. So including, I think I mentioned in Italy the 40-day resolution time for postal office issues. This is the average for those type of issues, whereas I think the 22 days is for all issues as a whole, is the average. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, yes.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, and let me also add to what you have said. In our benchmark table on handling end user complaints, Cullen International does the research and takes all the data from normally from the USP's annual reports or specific reports on how the USPs, the Universal Service Providers, handle their complaints and what are the resolution times, etc., etc. So yeah, these are the observed averages.
And in case you were asking about the number of days for the escalating bodies, that all of those days also refer to the reported average resolution times. Yes.
Thank you, Michael. So one more question I see posted by the participants. So do we know why eventually a postal item gets lost? I think this is about the operational efficiency of postal service providers, but Michael, Celine, if you could elaborate on it more.
Well, we don't exactly know in detail why exactly they get lost. We do see that loss is quite a significant part usually of why. But I mean, why does it get lost? We can talk about the e-commerce boom, perhaps.
Well, I mean, with the e-commerce boom, I can imagine that those operators need to handle a significant number of parcels per day. So
yes.
I'm sure that challenged their logistic chain, and in a world where everything is fast and with this huge number of parcels to be delivered, I guess that these operators could not spend the same amount of time per parcels. And I guess, and what we see, for example, where we are in Brussels or in Belgium, it's that those operators do not spend time to deliver, and sometimes it's they deliver with less cautious, if I may say, because they often drop it.
They're under time pressure because of these
volumes, so they drop it in front of the doors, or even on like unlocked lobbies in apartments complex. So yes, there is some vulnerability there. So, but it's my guess. I mean,
what we saw during, for example, the COVID-19 crisis as well, is when we saw these exploding volumes, and then sometimes operators just cannot keep up in terms of staffing. I mean, in the case of the COVID-19, for totally external reasons, there were a lot of sick days, this kind of thing. Yeah, and in these cases, you can imagine that first of all, during transit, there might be a lot of a sudden peaks, which are hard to deal with. Also during, for example, holiday times. where it's just easier. We cannot expect a perfect performance from our postal operators either. But no, these are some of the reasons why we might see lost items. Speculation.
Thank you both. There are quite other questions which I see. So when it comes to specific questions on these or that country cases, for example, I see a question raised about France. We have a postal team and postal analysts are following separate countries. So these specific country cases and questions related to those cases will be addressed later on via email to the person asking this question by our analyst who is in charge of following this particular country. Sure. And a couple of other questions related to organizational matters. Can we have these presentations? Of course, and as far as I can see, this presentation and maybe some other materials are already uploaded in the hands-out section. You can, I think, see them. So the presentation should be there, and you can, of course, see it later on at your convenience. There's another question. Can we watch the recording of this webinar at a later stage? And yeah, of course, the webinar will be made available afterwards. So yeah, I think you will receive a separate email with a recording. And if for whatever reason you were not able to join us for today's webinar, you can of course watch the recording and rewatch it just to dive deeper into details. And of course, if you want to see our faces again. Yeah, and we're getting closer to the end of our webinar. I would like to, and once again, no question will be left unanswered. As promised in the beginning, we will address all the questions that we received via email after the webinar. And the materials are available. The recording will be made available shortly. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that you may expect some other postal events by Colony International throughout this year. So please stay tuned to our email alerts. And last but not least, we will have a comprehensive postal masterclass, which is scheduled already for November, late November, 26th and 27th of November. The masterclass will be 2-day comprehensive training on different aspects related to the postal regulation and will be run by our postal analysts like Celine, Michael, myself, and others. So you are more than welcome to register for our postal masterclass, which will take place in Brussels, and this will be an in-person event. So we will be more than happy to meet you in person. I think this is all because we don't have much time to address other questions, but yeah, I think it was rather detailed, comprehensive. I would like to once again thank our analysts, Celine, Michael, well done, and to our participants for their time and patience and attention. And yeah, as I have mentioned, stay tuned. More to be expected from Colony International's postal service. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.